3, 2, 1. So, today is the start of Season 2 of the Student Recap Podcast, and we'll be talking about the coups that have happened in West Africa over the past few years and their effects on the world today. So obviously, a military coup overthrowing a democratic government has a big change on the geopolitical stage of that region. But we need to examine what really spurred these coups on and the effects that the people are having now after those coups have overthrown the democratic institutions that once supported their nations. So today we'll be talking about primarily the Alliance of Sahel States, or likewise as it's known in French, la Confédération des États du Sahel. So basically what has happened in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, which are the countries which make up the Alliance of Sahel States, they have split from their previous organization known as ECOWAS, and that's a sort of union between West African countries. They share the West African franc, which is a currency, and basically Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger all share the fact that since 2020 or later, they've had military interventions and coups that have led to the overthrow of a democratic government due to their inability to control the terrorism problem in the Sahara. Now, the terrorism problem in the Sahara and the Sahel is very important here because the civilians in these nations have been plagued by groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Greater Sahara, and Boko Haram for decades. And this has been pretty much uncontrolled. Actually, the French government in 2013 had to send in its own troops to Mali. Actually, 3,000 troops were stationed there yearly since 2013, and they were part of a special unit that was designed for counterterrorism operations. And it's ironic because Mali and Niger and Burkina Faso did not have units that were strong enough to combat the terrorist groups just by themselves. So, I'm reading here, so this French force was called Barkhane. But then in 2024, there was a large change. Barkhane got kicked out due to anti-Western sentiments in Mali, leading to a further restriction of international intervention in Mali. And now that brings us back to 2020. So starting on September 5th, 2020, there have been coups starting with Mali, then Burkina Faso, and Niger. And these three countries, they were very unstable, as I've said before, and they were not able to handle the violent situation that they had. Yet they had been ruled by a democratic coalition and had foreign intervention to help them combat these terrorist groups. But ultimately, that's not what the military of these nations wanted. The military wanted a stronger approach to what was happening. So, the effects of the military taking over the government in multiple countries, and even Guinea, which I'll talk about soon, has led to democratic backsliding. And this is because when military intervention takes over a government, it causes the democratic institutions that were once elected by the people to be removed from power. The military now has full power, oftentimes with martial law. Only generals and commanders can make decisions for the country, even let's say agricultural or economic ones that would be reserved for other departments. So this brings into question how a possible iron wall of nations is developing in West Africa, and that is why I wanted to talk about Guinea. So Guinea, even though it is not part of this new alliance of Sahel states, it is part of ECOWAS, of which states in the alliance of Sahel states were once part of as well. And this country of Guinea, it is connected to the ocean and additionally borders Mali, which borders Burkina Faso, and which borders Niger. And then this creates a scenario where a group of countries like that of in Europe have a certain political leaning, not the Soviet Union this time, but a autocratic, militarily ruled coalition. So this could create a corridor for trade and economic improvement, but that is all subject to whether the military ruling party allows it. And I just find it interesting, actually, that the president of Guinea, the interim president, General Mamadi Doumbouya, he actually has a very large influence on pop culture. So a few artists like Black M and Singleton have had songs produced for General Doumbouya, like praising him, and additionally they've been gifted things from the government, so pretty much open corruption, like a black Rolls Royce for the artist Black M. And this really shows the extent of which military governments have control in society, because force, it surmounts the democratic institutions, because when the will of the people is weak, then there is no way for it to defend itself from oppressors. So the military governments taking over these nations, they have more force than the people's will, because in countries like Guinea, the president was 83. Even though he was democratically elected, not many presidents around the world at that age have popular support from the people. They wanted a younger, charismatic leader. And that is like what has happened in many places around the world. In elections, there are more and more candidates skewing towards millennial and Gen X age rather than older generations like the boomers. So then, we realize that these states have democratic backsliding that is almost irrevocable. So, what have been the consequences in the region, particularly for the terrorist groups that have been operating there and that were the reason for these coups to happen for the most part? So, Boko Haram, ISIS, Greater Sahara, and Al-Qaeda's branches in West Africa have still attacked communities and civilians. And even though Mali kicked out the Burkina force of elite French soldiers because they thought that the French were being colonialist, they still have Wagner soldiers, which are just Russian mercenaries, or the Afrika Korps, which are also a branch of a Russian paramilitary. So it seems like there's no real change in the structure of international help in those areas. But in terms of the terrorist groups, they also seem to not have declined either. The attacks seem prominent, and there's no force that's strong enough to defeat them. I feel like this is part of a greater ideology battle in sub-Saharan Africa, because the decolonialization of Western Africa has led to a Pandora's box of ideas being presented to the people. And this isn't necessarily the best way for it to occur, because without decades of strong governmental institutions creating a stable country, then revolutionary ideas can spread easily. So, for example, when West African countries try to have a democracy like that of Western nations, it's much harder based on the system that they have, because it's not adequately built like the way France or the US or Canada or most other developed countries are. Therefore, even though military rule isn't good in these areas, it somehow seems to work better with the people's will, even if their rights are removed. And this brings into question, have the coups been effective at disrupting the corrupt and economically unstable situations of their nations? No, they have just created a new version of that, which in the end is exactly the same. And I actually would like to bring up one of my summer reading books, Animal Farm, because Napoleon the pig, he thought he was creating a revolutionary society that would benefit all. But in the end, he just copied the humans and created death and misery all in the meanwhile. So, while the nations in West Africa may struggle under democratic institutions that aren't built to handle modern problems, they need to exist, because any revolution will not change things. There has to be incremental change, even though it cannot be fully reverse the negative things in those nations, they have to be incrementally changed. Just like the civil rights movement in the US, change did not happen all at once with the brute force of one group or one person. It happened over 100 years. Some could say it's still ongoing, so over 150 years, and there's a necessity to understand the complexities of international relations. So now I'd like to bring up the themes of realism and constructivism. So first, realism. So realism is an international relations theory that states that nations are going to try to take advantage of each other and steal things from each other and create chaos between each other to benefit themselves. Now that might seem very crazy, but on a lesser scale, the military generals of these nations understand that they need to seek out the national interests of their people. And if those national interests weren't sought after by the previous leaders, even if those previous leaders were democratically elected and democracy is in the interest of the nation, they believe that there should be some change that benefits the nation more. So this is pretty stark, but it really just shows the mindset that some of these military leaders and commanders have, because when you're thinking in a standpoint that you need to defend yourself at all costs, it's very different than believing that other nations like France or nations in ECOWAS are willing to help you. But the state of the violence caused by terrorists in the sub-Saharan Africa region, or the Sahel, is just so massive that these countries within the alliance of Sahel states could not handle it, and that desperation caused them to have military overthrow. And I would also like to add in that the COVID pandemic really exasperated these nations because aid was much harder to get in, and you had to have all these medical supplies get in as well, which made the economic burdens on these poor nations more and more, which they probably weren't able to handle, especially under faulty systems that weren't made to handle crises like these. Constructivism is a theory also in international relations that states that individuals are constantly changing the world with ideas, because each individual's ideas influence others, and others take actions that change the world. So even though it might not seem that, let's say, a normal person in Chicago is going to change the entire city, well, the interactions of all those people do change the entire city, because how does an election work? Every single person uses their ideas to change the state that their situation is in. And that is the same with the world. So it seems like the Association of Sahel States wants to change the dynamic in West Africa. And the leaders of Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Guinea all seek to create change in their own manner. Now, that constructivism does not deem that all of these individuals wanting to create change are good or bad. It just says that they will. So even though these military leaders could be doing horrible things to the economy, to democratic institutions, like in Guinea, where the government is allegedly paying people to have demonstrations in support of the government and to actually counter the anti-government protests, that can still be an example of constructivism. Now, closing. So, even though the state of these nations is very dire right now, I believe that democratic backsliding can be reversed, but it requires major change. So, one key thing to see is that even though obviously the generals have total control of the nation in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Guinea, they're still considered interim presidents, which means that elections could eventually occur. And I could compare that to that in Brazil, when the military dictatorship, over a period of 20 years, slowly rescinded its power and led to first basically fake elections, but then let more and more candidates in. I think that is the true way that these states will go, because as constructivism states, individuals will constantly change the world. And if peace can never be achieved long term because individuals are constantly changing the world, then obviously these coups won't last. And even though it might take a long time and civil rights leaders will have to make increments of change over many, many decades, I do believe that the Association of Sahel States won't be able to stand the international pressures that are before it. War with terrorist groups without much international help, especially after splitting off from international unions that are supposed to help their member states, that won't work for combating a problem as large as terrorism. What the entire world should be able to learn from this conflict is that there's no way to successfully go through economic troubles by creating a completely new state in which your country is in. There's no way that a revolution will end successfully if the stated intentions are the same of the previous government. Now, while the previous government of these nations may not have stated the exact same thing, under realism, all nation states want to be wealthy and have prosperity for their citizens. Therefore, every single leader, regardless of political affiliation or way they get power, wants to have prosperity in some way. And that means there's a situation where the leaders that created a military coup want the same thing of the previous administration. Therefore, there's no point in having the coup. One final point. So I would actually like to bring up the strategic autonomy of India, if you know that foreign policy. So basically it talks about having your own perspective and not being influenced by larger blocks of nation states like that of Western ideologies or Sino or Russo ideologies that are more favorable to autocratic nations. So that would mean that the Alliance of Sahel States chooses to have its own policy independent of international groups of nations with shared ideas. Thank you for listening to the first episode of Student Recap Podcast Season 2, Episode 1, Coup d'etat. So, I wonder what you guys thought about this episode. I was kind of rushed for this episode, just so you guys know. But I did segment it out and do more research per section, so I hope that was seen in here. But yeah, see you guys later.